Can I do this? Can I create a page in my sketchbook that looks like Wainwright could have drawn it? If you're not sure who Alfred Wainwright is, keep watching. Hi, I'm Diane and I like to do long distance walks and share them with you in my sketchbook. A few weeks ago I visited the Northumberland National Park in the north of England. It's a stunning location. I filmed the walk and I'll be making a separate video about that. While I was on this walk, I managed to complete 2 sketches and brought them back with me. And I wanted to create a page layout using these sketches as inspiration. I've admired the illustrations created by Alfred Wainwright for quite some time now, and I have a couple of his books. Alfred Wainwright is perhaps best known for his pictorial guides to the Lakeland Fells. These books are handwritten and hand-drawn works of art, and I've admired his illustrations for years. He described these books as a love letter to the Lakeland Fells. As I said, I've always admired him not just as a walker but as an illustrator, and that's what I'm going to try and recreate in my sketchbook today. I don't think he's ever illustrated the walk that I'm going to do, but I'm going to use his methods and style to try and create a page layout in my sketchbook. I'm going to use the drawings I did on location as a guide, and also some of the photographs and videos that I took. Here's what I'm going to use today. As well as my sketchbook, I'm going to use these fine liner pens in different sizes. The finest pen is 005. The one in between is 03. And the thickest pen I'm going to use is 08. I'm also going to use a mechanical pencil, an eraser and a ruler. But first of all, I'm going to study Wainwright's illustrations and do a warm-up exercise. Looking at Wainwright's drawings, he looks like he uses line work to create the tonal value and differences between the textures. So up here it's more of a squiggly line, and here it's lines going across, and it's done in a really neat way. And I think over here he's done a bit of stippling. So let's do a practice before we start. I'm going to use 2 spare pieces of paper and draw 4 rectangles on them as a guide. I find it more comfortable to turn the paper and then start the warm-up exercise. I'm going to draw lines going across. At the top they're going to be quite spaced out, and then gradually I'm going to bring them in. It doesn't have to be exact, this is just a warm-up exercise. And then as you get to the bottom, just make them closer together. But you'll see by doing that the ones that are spaced out further, the tonal value seems to be lighter, and then when you get to the bottom where they're more bunched together, your eye sees that as a darker tone. And this is what I think Wainwright is doing in his illustrations. The other technique he seems to be using is stippling. If you don't know what that is, it's just placing dots on the paper. I'm going to space them out at the top. As I get nearer to the bottom of the square, I add in more dots. I think you can see that adding more dots closer together makes it look a darker tone. I've done this really quickly, but you can take your time, and this is a good warm-up exercise. The next line that I'm going to practice is cross-hatching. I noticed in his illustrations that the lines tend to go in the same direction, and these types of lines follow the contour of the shape he's trying to draw. But I thought I would include cross-hatching because I have a feeling this might make things slightly easier, but we'll see when I get to the main drawing. So you do lines going in one direction, and then the cross-hatching part is when you go across the lines. it looks like that. And the closer the lines are together, the darker the tone looks. So let's do some more at the bottom. Do it quite close together. I'm doing this really quick. I think Wainwright was very neat and methodical, so his lines were very straight. So there you go. So that looks a darker tone than that. This next line that I'm going to practice, Wainwright very, very rarely uses because it looks quite messy. But I've noticed for some of the walls that he's illustrated, he creates a type of pattern. When I practice it here, I'm also using different line widths. Looking at his illustrations, it looks as if he uses the same line width. Say if it's a wall or something like that, he'll create this sort of look, which is more of a pattern, I would say. So the texture of a wall or a plant or whatever is created through this pattern. I'll show you on here. So there, he's done the dry stone wall as almost like semicircles joined together. He's done the water as lines going across, and some are completely dark and others he's left more spaces. And on the rocks he's got the lines going down. Now it's all, this sort of line is also called a contour line, so the line follows the shape of the object. I think here is more of a stippling technique. So for each area of the drawing, he's created a different sort of texture through the line work. He's created depth of tone by having the lines closer together, and he's used patterns. And that's what I'm going to try and do in my Wainwright style page. I'm also going to try and do these maps. His are very precise and methodical and neat. This is going to be a real challenge for me, but I'm going to give it a go. You can see the difference. You can see the difference between mine and his, but I'll try very hard to be neat. If we want to make things a bit easier for ourselves, we could vary the line width. So this is the number 8, which is a bit thicker than that, and you can see, having a thicker line, what a difference that makes to the tonal value. It stands out a lot more. You could just practice making different shapes. So this is a very thin, 005 is a very thin line, and you can see the difference. But as I said, I don't think Wainwright seems to have varied the line width. He must have been using a pen and ink, and the nib on the pen was the same throughout all his illustrations. I decided to do more of a messy squiggly line just to see what difference it will make in terms of texture. It does look very different from the circles. I don't think this is the line that Wainwright would use because it's far too messy. He's a very neat, methodical, precise illustrator, and his maps and his notes on the walks are also like that. But you can have a go and see the difference. The lines, the stippling, the cross hatching and pattern in different line widths. For the next part of this challenge, I needed to create a layout and I decided to use a double page spread. I noticed that Wainwright does the map on the right hand side and then there's illustrations on the left, and sometimes there's text on the left as well. But I settled on a design of having 2 illustrations on the left hand page and a map on the right hand side with some text. I rearranged the illustrations that I did on the walk, and I was going to use them as a guide to what would appear on the left hand page. And I quite liked that size, so I drew around the paper to get them in the same proportion. This next part of the process, I used the pencil to create an outline of what I wanted to draw. And then it was a case of going in with the fine liner pen and using a photograph and my illustration as a guide. I decided to outline everything with a line first because I thought that would be the easiest thing to do. But it was at this point where I'm thinking, I'm not sure I can do this. If you look at Wainwright's illustrations, they're so precise. I can be neat in my illustrations, but I'm not that neat. I decided just to go through with this and continue and see what happens. I can't help but add my own style to the drawing, but that's okay. I just want to be influenced by this style and see what the end result is. It may affect what I draw in the future in a positive way. So here you can see I'm outlining the first scene. This was the first place where we took a rest and looked at the view. It was a really peaceful place. I've actually done this walk before and sat in the same spot, and it overlooks a place called Dove Crag. It's such an amazing view, and it is really worth spending 10 minutes just looking at the view, and if you're doing a drawing, it makes it even better. The next part of this, I try to do some of those neat lines that Wainwright does. I'm laughing because this is the point where I realised that this wasn't going to be easy. As you can see in my original illustration, I like to use washes. For the tonal value, I'll put in a wash of ink just to suggest the background. But this isn't an option when you're just using line work. And this is a real discipline to not to resort to putting in washes of ink. When I got to this stage of the drawing, I decided to compartmentalise each section of the drawing. Looking at Wainwright's illustrations, he adds tone and different patterns in different areas of the illustration, and that's how he differentiates the foreground from the background. Here I'm trying the squiggly circles. I'm also adding in the deep, darker tones before tackling some of the lighter tones. The hardest part about line work is to differentiate the foreground from the background. And one way of doing it is to make the lines less and less the further out in the composition you go. There was a background line of trees that I was trying to put into the drawing, and I decided just to do that as a line and not do any more shading. I noticed that Wainwright didn't do a complete square. He would sometimes leave the top of the drawing with no sky or anything. So the bottom part of the drawing would be a square, and then the top would be where the horizon ended. And this is what I decided to do, but I was looking at his illustrations, looking at my reference, which was the photo on my original illustration I did on the spot, and just trying to make it make sense with line work. This was the first illustration that I did. It wasn't bad, but I think I was happier with the second illustration that I did. I decided to make the foreground very dark and then graduate the tone into a lighter tone for the background. And I thought that would be a really good way of differentiating foreground from background. And this is something Wainwright seems to do in his illustrations. He also suggests vegetation by making certain lines, and I tried to copy that here. This area is known for its heather. So you will see lots of heather growing on the way up and at the top of the cairn. I'm going to make a separate video of the walk, and you can see the landscape and the walk in that video, but I thought I would concentrate on the drawings in this video. Now we're moving on to the second illustration that I did at the bottom of the left-hand page, and I'm trying out some contour lines, and that just means I'm following the shape of this stone at the side. I'm also trying to draw this area of grass that was near the stone. I found drawing the vegetation harder than drawing the rocks because the grass was actually white against a dark background, so I was having to shade in between the blades of grass. Whereas the rocks were quite easy because I drew a contour line that suggests the shape. Here I'm drawing some of the vegetation at the top, but I'm making it quite dark because it's in the foreground. And then I've done my favourite, which is the squiggly lines to suggest more vegetation growing on top of the rock. You will notice that I changed the composition of both these drawings when you compare it to the original ones I did on location. The original drawing I did on location didn't have the rock to the left, but I quite like the shape of the two rocks as you look down on the view, so I've made the composition different for this drawing. When I started the second illustration, it dawned on me how time-consuming it must have been for Wainwright doing all the maps. Wainwright did the walks first, and then he would have taken notes and done drawings while he did the walk. And then he would have spent a lot of time creating the illustrations and mapping out the route. Each walk must have been a labour of love for him. It took me a couple of afternoons to complete these 2 pages, and it would have taken Wainwright even longer than that because he was mapping out a route. I remember watching a documentary about him and his life. He would spend a whole weekend going on the walk and making notes, and then he would spend another weekend up in his attic drawing out the illustrations and the map. He said that if he'd completed a page layout and he found a mistake on it, he would start again from scratch. I can't imagine spending hours doing a drawing and creating a map and then just scrapping the whole thing. But he was such a perfectionist, that's what he'd do. And I also remember him saying in the documentary that he calculated it would take him 10 years to complete his project, illustrating all the Lakeland fells he wanted to illustrate. This puts things into perspective for me because I spent a couple of afternoons and then I've edited the video and put the video together, and I don't think it would have taken me as long as it would have taken Wainwright. I don't think Wainwright ever visited this particular walk, but I did think about him when I was doing the drawings and how dedicated he was and how much he loved the countryside. I'm finishing off this illustration here, but I do go back to it later and add some finishing touches when I've completed the full spread. I think this was one of my favourite drawings. Let's move on to the right hand page here and the map. The walk I did takes you along the ridge of the Simonside Hills, and there are 5 cairns or summits along the way. I drew the 5 cairns and then I made a dotted line showing the route of the walk. This is the style that Wainwright used in his maps of the walks that he documented. The walk we did was a circular walk from the car park along the ridge of Simonside Hills, down through some woodland back to the car park. I've made a separate video about this walk. If you want to see the walk and see the beautiful scenery, I put more detail in that video. While I was on the walk, I did 2 sketches. The first sketch I did was on the second cairn, which overlooks Dove Crag. And then the second illustration I did was on the last cairn before you descend back down onto the footpath and on the road back to the car park. You can do this walk the other way. Some people were walking to the end and then retracing their steps back to the car park and didn't do the circular walk through the wood. I've kept this map very simple and I've labelled the 5 cairns. I also added symbols that you'd most likely see on a map. There was a wood beneath the hills that had pine trees, so I did a pine tree symbol. One of the things that Wainwright didn't do was to make notes about any of the wildlife he saw on his walk. I tend to add in wildlife that I've seen when I do sketches of the walks that I've done, so this is an element that I decided to add in because it reflects my style and I didn't want to completely copy what Wainwright did. This was a way of making this page my own. I also have a story attached to this bee that I'm drawing. This bee is known as a mountain bumblebee and it's one of my favourite bees. It's actually quite rare to see this particular bee and you can only see them in the north of England. They are distinguished by having a red abdomen. As this is a black and white drawing, I couldn't include the colours, but I have written a description by the side so you can see what this bee actually looks like. He is also known as a bilberry bumblebee. The reason why I like this bee was I've done this walk about 4 times, and the first time I did it, I was having a rest in the wood. I was sitting and enjoying my surroundings when one of these bees actually landed on my hand. I was so startled to see this bee. I knew it was quite rare and it felt like a really special moment. Every time I go to this area, I think about this particular bee. They are becoming more and more rare. I'm glad that they still exist within this particular environment. So this is my drawing in honour of the mountain bumblebee, and here is the description. One of the last illustrations I added to this spread was of the signpost that was near the car park. I wanted to add it next to the description because there was a space at the top of the page and I thought it would be great to have it near the introduction. I managed to stick to using the 005 pen for most of the illustrations and the thicker pens for the text. Although I'd practiced the cross-hatching before I started these drawings, I did try and limit the use of cross-hatching to honour the Wainwright style. But let me know what you think to the final result. The last thing to do was to finish adding all the text. After erasing all the pencil marks, let's look at the final result. If you want to know more about Wainwright, there is a website you can visit and it's created by the Wainwright Society and there's lots of information on there. As you can probably tell by this video, Wainwright is one of my heroes. for his skills as an illustrator, for his quiet determination, for leaving a legacy that inspires, and for keeping on going and never giving up.